All right, guys, so our class today is inspections and inspection negotiations. What are inspections? So inspections are the actual inspections done by inspectors and reports that you receive during the physical inspection contingency. So you'll hear physical contingency, physical period, referred to as inspections, or the inspection period. So like I mentioned previously, before I introduced Mindy to talk about the NHD report, you want to go ahead and make sure you get the seller disclosure package before your inspections, if at all possible. That's not always possible because you want to get your inspections done as quickly as you can. So as soon as I open escrow, I transfer all of the information I need to everyone involved. But then, right after I do that, I call the buyer and I ask them what inspections they want. Usually the time frame for physical inspection is anywhere from 7 to 17 days. Usually on a condo in a competitive market, you can get it done in about 7 days. Why? A condo doesn't have as many inspections. A single family residence is going to take a little bit more time. I recommend not writing shorter than 10 days if at all possible in order to get the escrow. But the standard time frame would be about 14 days on a single family for your physical inspection contingency. But all of those things are negotiable. And the seller disclosure contingency period, the way it's written into the contract, is boilerplate of 7 days, right? I actually like to shorten that up to 5 days. And if I can get the seller disclosure package from the listing agent prior to that time, I ask for it. I ask for it right away, and I explain to them that I would like to read it and review it with my buyers. Mindy, you're literally blocking the recording.
Oh, God. I'm so sorry.
It's
Thank
okay.
you. Thank you.
Thanks. So I tell them I want to review that so that we can have our inspectors look at anything specific if there's something disclosed. What could possibly be disclosed in seller disclosures? Oh, anything, right? But maybe there was a past leak or past mold somewhere. So maybe now I want to have a mold inspection, which I wouldn't necessarily recommend as a core inspection. I would recommend that usually as a secondary inspection, although your buyer is free to have as many as they like. Maybe there was a leak in a roof, so you want to have the general inspector check out that section of the roof more carefully. It just sets you up to really point out what should have an extra close look. So on that note, we're going to talk about what are core inspections. Guys, any ideas? What are core inspections? Core, I would say, are the things that no buyer should ever go without. So if it's a condo, generally that would be a general inspection. And if there's a chimney in place, I would also have that chimney checked out, even if it was a condo. On a single family, that would be a general inspection, a sewer line inspection, a chimney if there is one, a termite inspection. Guys, here's a note, do not include your termite inspection anywhere in your purchase contract. If you do, the lender may want to see it and may try to require fumigation prior to issuing loan documents. Okay, so your buyer can do any inspection they want. It does not have to be written into the contract. So I highly recommend not writing that in. It used to be a long time ago, well, not even a long time ago. Up until a few years ago, the seller typically obtained a termite report even before going to market a lot of times and provided that termite report to the buyer, and it was part of the typical contract terms that the seller would complete all section 1 items, which would be like active infestation, wood rot, things like that. That is no longer the case. It is completely negotiable. The reason for that is because the seller was, if they didn't have the termite report prior to going to the market, if they're required to complete section 1 items, they're basically writing a blank check. They have no idea what that's going to cost. And it can get expensive, especially on craftsman old wood homes. You know, if your seller had to pay $20,000 unexpectedly out of their proceeds, or even prior to the deal having all contingencies removed, they may not be able to close that escrow. They may not be able to buy the new home they're going to move into. It may screw up their future plans for what was going to happen afterwards. So that's why we keep termite outside of the contract. Okay, so back to the single family core inspections. I said general, sewer, termite. If there is a pool, definitely pool. If there is a chimney, definitely a chimney. Now, if the house or condo, well, not a condo, but if the house is on a hillside, I would also say that a geological inspection is probably a core inspection. Geological inspections can be expensive, and you can have the company come out, and a lot of them will give you options, such as just a verbal. A verbal is hard to negotiate with. So when would the buyer opt possibly for a verbal from the geological inspector? Maybe if there's no problem, maybe if there's no issue. If there are issues, I highly recommend encouraging the buyer to get the higher cost written report from the geological inspector. Now, secondary inspections. Secondary inspections you would set up after having your core inspections at the recommendation of the inspectors that actually perform the inspection from the core. So let's say you have your general inspection and the general inspector says, looks like the roof needs some work here. Looks like there's been water intrusion here. What am I going to do then? I'm going to set up probably a roof inspection. And the reason I set up my inspections in the beginning, as soon as I open escrow, is so that if I need a secondary inspection, like a roof inspection now I have the time to, right? Because I took care of my core inspections right away. Maybe the general inspection inspector says, oh, there's an elevated level of moisture here. It may be, but I don't see anything, or I do see something there. You know, maybe at that time I say to the buyer, hey, probably want to have a mold inspection here. There can be a whole laundry list of things. You know, maybe the general inspector says, oh, there's, it looks like there's some cracks, some movements here. I see some instability in the foundation. Then I'm gonna want a structural engineer to come out, or recommend to the buyer that I have a structural engineer come out and do the report. So that's why I have the core inspection set up initially, and that's why I have time for the secondary inspections, right? So just a note, be wary of the inspection report that the seller provides, or if the property was previously in escrow and the buyer got inspections, right? You don't know where that inspection report came from unless you recognize the name of the company and the inspector on the report. And each inspector is different, so even if you like the company, they may be more or less experienced than another inspector. Also, guys, inspectors are just sometimes wrong with no malice. Completely wrong. I've had that happen many times where they say something is non-functional in the house, where they just didn't know how to turn it on, or we couldn't find the switch. Also, I have seen straight fraud. I have been provided termite reports by really, really high-end agents on really expensive homes. And I always recommend my buyer has their own termite anyhow. It's $99, why the hell not? And you know, there's completely active infestation. Or there are complete sections of the property that have not been inspected. You know, let's say I have a large estate home that has pool house, gazebo, you know, things like that, they just haven't been checked at all. Or the garage is somehow excluded, right? You want to make sure these things are looked at when you have your buyer's termite inspector come out. Who pays for inspection, guys? Buyer pays, yeah, the buyer pays. If you're going to take a listing and you see that a house is in a lot of disrepair, you may want to advise the seller at that time to get a pre-inspection report, a pre-listing inspection. Why? Because you know what you're working with then. You may want to put those reports up on the MLS and adjust the price accordingly, so that you don't have to deal with it falling in and out of escrow and days on market and subsequent problems, right? It's always easier to put it out there first and have a buyer willing to accept it as is if you have a property that looks like it's in a lot of disrepair or needs a lot of work. Also, as an agent, if you see something that's really out of the ordinary, it's just risk control. If I see something that looks like structurally it's not sound, there's been a lot of movement, you know, I'm not an expert, but I do know that if I can tell that something's wrong there, probably a buyer can too, and an inspector is going to be able to. And I need to find out what's going on there. It may be something that's just cosmetic, and if so, I'd like to be able to circumvent that. Or if there's a major problem, I'd like to advise, you know, maybe the seller wants to have it repaired ahead of time. Who knows? So that'd be the time that I would ask the seller to do it, and in that case, the seller would generally pay for it. All right? So your standard inspection process in escrow, who should be there, guys? Everybody, well, not the seller. So, sellers ask me all the time to be there, and I ask them not to be. It's so impossible. Sellers, I don't care how reasonable or nice they are, right? They have pride in their home, they love their home, and it would drive me nuts if an inspector came into my home and started picking it apart, down to the nitty gritty. It is very problematic. Get your seller out of there. Also, that's your buyer's time, and we don't want the buyer and seller to interface, right? So I know a lot of buyers think that's weird if they've ever purchased out of state, because that's not the case. In California, in our area, buyers and sellers do not meet, they do not mingle, they do not talk. But both the listing agent and the buyer's agent should be there. If you are a listing agent and you are not at inspections, shame on you. That's like the most important thing you can do. I know life happens, so what should you guys do if you can't be at your listings inspections or your buyer's inspections? You're gonna find an agent you really trust and respect in the office. You're gonna offer them whatever you need to get someone there on your behalf. And you're gonna ask them to take a lot of notes, maybe even video for you. And you're gonna make a follow-up call after that's done and you have the time, once you get that information and the report, and you're gonna actually sit down and call the inspector, go over that report. Same thing if you're the buyer's agent. So that is definitely one of your most important responsibilities as an agent, is to be there during the inspections. A lot of that information is subjective. Who gets a copy of the report, guys? Oh, and by the way, if your buyer can't be there, if it doesn't affect your timeframes, try to work around the buyer's schedule. It is very important. Things can look very scary in inspection reports that aren't necessarily scary, are easy fixes. And the best person to explain that at the time is going to be the inspector in person, because the inspector in person is going to give you sort of their honest professional opinion, right? Whereas in the report, they're required to list things as a safety hazard that may be a minor concern in their opinion or in the buyer's opinion, but when they say it's a safety hazard in any form in an inspection report, it looks really scary, right? So do yourself a favor, set yourself up for success as the listing agent or the buyer's agent, and be there as the agent, and make sure if you're the buyer's agent that the buyer's there. All right, so who gets a copy of these inspection reports? Everybody, your broker, your transaction coordinator, not escrow, not your lender. That's important, guys. Do not send your inspection reports to your lender or to your escrow officer.
And why is that?
Well, if your lender sees any inspection reports, they may all of a sudden start asking you to have items taken care of before they'll lend.
Yeah.
And escrow has nothing to do with it.
Yeah.
If escrow has a copy of it, who can get a hold of it? The lender. So, everybody gets a copy. A lot of agents, a lot of buyer's agents like to withhold the inspection reports until the time the buyer makes the request for repairs. Why? Because the seller maybe feels more pressure, they can get contingencies removed if they simply give in to the buyer's requests. Well, if I'm the listing agent, I'm not gonna take that. The seller and the listing agent are required, or are entitled legally to the inspection reports at the time you receive them. If I'm the listing agent, I'm giving the inspector my business card directly because I'm a good listing agent and I am physically present. Some inspectors will withhold those reports and just send them to the buyer's side. Just call the company and get them directly if you can't get them from the buyer's agent. Why? I like to read them and I wanna get ahead of any potential problems that are there. So if I'm the listing agent and I see that there's a major concern, I'm advising the seller right away and we're getting our own estimates for that work and secondary opinions. I wanna be prepared for that buyer request. Also, like I said, inspectors' reports aren't always accurate. So, you know, if I'm gonna get some $20,000 request for a repair or a credit, what if it's not substantiated? What if that inspector was wrong, or they're simply committing fraud, or someone else is, right? So do yourself a favor, do the seller a favor, and get those inspection reports and be proactive, and make sure you do the research into that stuff and get second opinions. I'm not saying on everything, I'm only saying, you know, if there's a big ticket item.
Sorry, can I ask,
Yeah.
when do you said like, you know, you don't give to the escrow none of the inspections report because of the reasons that we just mentioned, but then when you gonna give those documents to them, to the escrow? Never?
Never. Escrow doesn't need them and they're not entitled to them.
Okay, so then the transaction coordinator, it is, right?
You give it to the transaction coordinator because they need to make sure it gets to the other side and also to your client for signature.
Okay, perfect.
But guys, who's responsible if your transaction coordinator doesn't transfer that? And yeah, within in their time frame, you. So I don't care if you have a transaction coordinator. By the way, ours, Brian, he's amazing. He's, in my entire career, and I don't give out compliments lightly, he is the best I have ever used. But do I still check? Yes, I do, because he's human, right? And do yourselves a favor, if you're working with tight time frames and you need to get documentation over to anyone within a certain time frame because of a contingency deadline, make sure he knows. Type in the subject line urgent, right? And if it's really that urgent, just do it yourself. It takes a second. CC him on it, right? If if it's 11 o'clock at night and I realize the prelim hasn't gone out to the buyer, and the prelim, guys, is a seller disclosure contingency. It's the 7th day and it's 11 p.m. at night. Am I gonna send it over to my transaction coordinator or ask him about it? No, I'm just gonna send it out and I'm gonna CC him on it. Okay, so where was I? Let's see, who should be there, who gets a copy, sharing. Let's talk about problems with performing inspections, okay? What's the most common problem for performing inspections? Well, there are two that I think are equally common. One, the utilities are not on. If the utilities aren't on, guys, the inspector can't inspect. So, do yourself a favor. If it's a vacant home or a new home or a remodeled home that's vacant, ask the listing agent if the utilities are on. If they are not, you need to make sure that the seller is on getting those inspections turned on. If you're the listing agent, make sure utilities are on if you're on the market. It can take sometimes 2 weeks to get a utility turned on. If it's a new construction and they failed to get the new utility meter replaced at all, it can be a month. And I have run into that. I have literally been in escrow as the buyer's agent and it took us a month to get a utility turned on in order to inspect. Yeah.
What would you do in that situation? You extend the inspection period and?
Yeah, you would ask the listing agent and seller to extend the inspection period, or maybe, put the escrow on, not on hold, literally, but just, to extend all of the contingency and close dates out, starting from the date that you can actually inspect. Also, I've had listing agents sometimes say, oh, well, the seller's kid is having a party or this or that. So, no, I know it's Thursday, but we can't get you in Friday, Saturday, over the weekend, and then Monday is their anniversary or their party. Okay, no problem. You're gonna go ahead and extend my buyer's contingency period by that number of days, right? I can nearly guarantee you that they're gonna give you access on the day you request if that's the case. Or they're going to extend it. But you as the buyer is entitled to access at any reasonable time to conduct inspections. If the seller is blocking access, then they need to extend that contingency period for you, okay? All right. The other problem is simply access, like we discussed. The listing agent is busy, the seller is busy, so not your problem. Extend. They need to extend. The third biggest problem I run into is invasive inspection. The buyer's inspectors are not allowed to damage the property. They're not allowed to open walls, right? So if I've had an inspection with a general inspector and they say, hey, there's moisture, elevated moisture here, and it looks like there's something there, and I have to set up a mold inspection. So those air tests for mold, guys, they're not accurate whatsoever. A mold inspection, they have to actually take a sample of the material that they think there may be mold on. What would they have to do in order to take that sample? They have to open up a wall or actually remove a piece of the property, no matter how minuscule that size is, right? So you're gonna have to get written permission from the seller in order to perform some inspections. Septic, if you ever have a septic and it needs to be inspected, good luck, guys. They actually have to literally dig the tank up and open it to inspect it. I'm not even gonna go into that. There's a whole huge document in car forms just for septic now. But that's called invasive inspection. Now let me give you an example of the most common type of quote unquote invasive inspection I run into is that the general inspector wants to open up the electrical panel and it's painted over. So they actually have to take a screwdriver, a pocket knife or something and cut around the edge of the panel to open it and inspect inside. Can they do that? They can, but only if the seller says it's okay. So what I'm gonna do at that point is I'm gonna ask the listing agent to contact the seller and get approval to do that. And we're gonna move on to the rest of the inspection prior. Another problem I run into is, let's say you're doing a sewer line inspection. Anybody ever have root intrusion during a sewer line inspection and the inspector wasn't able to go all the way out to the main line connection to the city? Yeah, so what needs to happen then is probably the seller needs to have the line hydrojetted. And by the way, hydrojetting can actually cause damage sometimes. So you definitely want the seller to be the one to initiate and take care of this. You're gonna need to have the inspection contingency possibly extended based upon the time frame the seller has for getting it hydrojetted. And then the buyer's inspector is gonna have to go back out and do the inspection. A lot of times between buyer and seller agent, you just negotiate that whoever the seller hired for the hydrojetting actually conducts the rest of the inspection. Why? Because you almost always wanna ask the seller to pay for that re-inspection fee. And so if that's the case, I make sure that the seller is getting an inspection with video, right? Because now you're getting a seller inspection, you can't necessarily rely on it, right? What can you rely on? You can rely on that video footage. So that's the most common problem I find with inspections. Let's see. I was thinking of something else. Oh, as a secondary precaution, if the seller is actually having the sewer line hydrojetted and getting the video, you may want to send over the video to the buyer's original inspector that you hired and ask them just to take a look at the video, okay? All right, let me tell you a little story. So that dual representation we were talking about, I did one fairly recently. The buyer was a real estate agent in New York, wasn't familiar with the process out here, had never done anything except for sell condos or lease condos. And she had every single inspection, I think I've never had more inspections done on a property. And it was like pulling my hair out. I lived at that house, right? I was like, hi everyone, I'm back. What's in the fridge? I'm hungry. The buyer had an HVAC inspection done, even though our general inspector said the HVAC system was fine. At this point, I'm starting to think, oh great, she's just fishing for things to try to negotiate the price down, right? Well, her inspector came in, he went up into the attic, and he actually started dismantling the HVAC in order to inspect it. That is invasive inspection. That is not allowed, and I was in a really funky spot. I had actually left the property because the inspector was an hour and a half late, and I had other appointments, but my seller was there. The buyer wasn't there. And she was like, yeah, he's doing stuff up in the attics, he's being really loud. So I said, okay, put me on speaker. And I asked him what he was doing, and he told me he was dismantling like the blower motor. I don't know what a blower motor is, but I know he's not allowed to dismantle anything. So it was a really funky position, but I had to say, sir, I'm really sorry, but I need you to put everything back exactly the way it was when you found it, and I need you to leave now. And then I had to hang up, pick up the phone, and call my buyer and say, hey, I want you to know that they're not allowed to do this, and that if there is any problem where he didn't put anything back properly, you're gonna be on the hook for any repair work for the seller. And this is all written into our contract that any damage caused by the buyer's inspector, the buyer's actually responsible for. Another problem I run into, there's no main sewer line clean out, and so the sewer line inspector is gonna go down from another source of entry. A lot of times it's the toilet. I've had them actually break the toilet before. What happened in this case, the buyer's agent, I notified him and they just paid for having it replaced by anyone the seller wanted right away. And that's what we did. That's all negotiable at the end of the day. This was a super high-end home. So I think that's why the buyer's agent paid for it. On your standard, who are you gonna have pay for it? Probably the buyer. That's a little tricky though, because it's probably your recommended inspector, right? So just be aware of these things. Let's see here. So, you need written inspection reports, guys. As the buyer's agent, once you have them all, I send them all over to the buyer, even if they have them already. If they've chosen not to have any main, like, core inspections, I actually send over a buyer's inspection waiver form, BIW, that's a car form, BIW. So if they're like, no, I don't need a sewer line inspection, or no, I don't need a chimney inspection, no, I don't need a pool inspection, especially if they don't want a general inspection, I'm gonna fill out that buyer inspection waiver. And basically what it says on there is that I've advised my buyers to have this report, or inspection, but they've chosen not to, and it releases you from liability and the brokerage from liability. You just don't wanna get into a situation where you close, the buyer finds out that there's a problem, and the buyer's like, well, my agent didn't tell me that was important. We don't wanna get in that situation. Alright. So, let's talk about managing client expectations now. So we're gonna talk about it from the listing agent end and separately from the buyer's agent end, okay? So if you're representing the seller and you get inspection reports, you had better read those reports, and even better yet, you were there and you talk to your seller after and give them sort of a summary after any inspection that takes place. But you're gonna get these inspection reports, you're gonna talk to your seller, and you're gonna go over anything that may be of concern. Particularly things that are safety issues that the inspector said definitely should be addressed. Alright, this would be like problems with electrical, structural issues, mold, plumbing, yes, anything that's a major issue, okay? So what I'm going to tell my seller at this point is, if I was the buyer's agent, I would be advising the buyers probably to ask for these, major areas of concern. People get freaked out when they see asbestos. By the way, asbestos is in a lot of piping for ventilation and things like that. It's usually in the attic, or you might see it on an exhaust pipe from a water heater in a water heater closet or stuck in a garage. Asbestos, as long as it's not, as long as the pipe is not damaged or removed or opened up or cut, it doesn't go anywhere. And it's pretty easy to get rid of it. And if you ever need an asbestos mediation company, I have a really good cheap one that does it with permit. I don't even know how they get away with doing it so cheap. Just make sure you're aware of these things. Asbestos is not a problem unless it's disturbed. Mold, typically, same thing, not a problem unless it's disturbed. So if you have an inspection report and you're telling your seller this, make sure you tell them, do not touch those things. Yes?
If a property is being advertised as is, seller is not gonna give any credit for repairs or anything, then how would that come into play?
It doesn't. Our contract says that all properties are sold in as-is condition.
No, but that if you specifically state that the seller
Doesn't
is
matter.
not giving
Buyer
any
can
credit.
ask for anything they want to. They can cancel the transaction if they don't like the seller's response to any request they make. So, just because it says as is does not mean a buyer can't ask, but whether or not it says as is in the contract or not, the seller can say no or refuse to respond at all, right? So, it's all negotiable. I don't care what it says, it
As
doesn't
far as
matter.
repairs and credits,
Mhm.
like,
Now, what I would think would be more reasonable is the seller knows that there's an issue and they provide you those reports up front at the time or prior to the time you guys make an offer. It'd be pretty hard to negotiate asking for a credit or repair at that point, right? Probably. So, that's why I told you, as a listing agent, if I take a listing, and I see that there's gonna be a potential issue, I advise the seller to get a pre-inspection report. And I just disclose that up front. Alright, so as a listing agent, I'm advising the seller on what I think the buyers may ask for, and what any other potential buyer, if we don't close this escrow, might be concerned about. And if they're big ticket items, I am probably recommending that the seller have someone come in and give an estimate, right? Or I'm saying to the seller, I know this inspector, I know they're pretty reputable, let me see though if I can send the inspection report out, because a lot of times you can send that inspection report out and get estimates based on the information provided in the report, and someone doesn't have to come out on behalf of the seller. That being said, be careful to review the scope of work included in estimates, right? There could be a huge price difference between one estimate and another. Make sure it's not because something's being shortcut or removed from that scope of work entirely, okay? So a lot of times when I get a buyer's estimate on something, let's say it's a chimney, right? It's a $20,000 tally for estimated repair work. I'm going to take that estimate and maybe send it over to a couple of people I trust who do chimney work, and I'm going to ask them to give me an estimate based on the same scope of work, right? Same scope of work is very important. Now, if they're minor things or there's only one thing, I may not advise the seller to get an estimate or a second opinion. Sort of gauge it and gauge where you're at with the buyers and their attitude, and you'll know because you were a good listing agent and you were there for their inspections. You'll know how they reacted and how the buyer's agent is positioning it. By the way, I want to stress at this time, it is super important, guys, to solidify your relationship with the agent on the other side, no matter who you're representing, right? Basically, as agents, you have to represent your clients' wants and needs, but you are on the same team. You guys are trying to resolve, any requests with what the seller wants to grant to the buyer together, right? So, I'll go into a little bit further later as far as my strategies, but you're on the same team. Just keep that mentality, right? The seller wants to sell, the buyer wants to buy, and both agents want to close the deal, right? And make their clients happy. So, keep the ego out of it. Don't get angry. As the buyer's agent, I've seen the listing agent get angry so many times. And I like to remind them, hey, I'm simply representing my clients. This is information we got. Let's look at it together. Obviously, the seller is going to have to share this information with any other potential buyers. So let's get down to it and work on it together. Do you have any ideas? Let's see here. Okay, so managing your client's expectations. So we just talked about it, what I would do with the seller if I had any, big ticket items or, red alert items. And what I mean by red is I'm actually referring to most inspectors, especially general inspectors, in their inspection reports, they will have like 3 sections. Green for fine, yellow for needs attention, or maybe it was at code at the time it was built, it's not at code now. Could be, it's nearing the end of its lifespan, could be a potential problem later, and then needs attention, which is generally coded as red, and is usually visually coded in these colors in your inspection reports. And there's usually a summary sheet that has all of these things so that you can review that with your buyer or seller, okay? Any inspector who's not giving you stuff that is sort of blocked out into those 3 categories is doing you a disservice, and you might want to find a different inspector. So, if I'm representing the buyer now, I need to manage expectations. First and foremost, I will have buyers, especially first-time buyers, they expect everything to be perfect. And when we start to talk about the inspection reports and what they'd like to ask for, if I don't manage their expectations, they're saying they want every single thing that's not perfect fixed. My recommendation and the thing that's worked for me in the past is, I'm sorry guys, we are not buying new construction. If we were buying new construction, we could expect that every single thing would be taken care of. So what I'd like you to do, especially in a competitive market like we're in now, maybe when it changes and it's a buyer's market, maybe it's easier to ask for more repairs or credits at that time, but we're not there yet, and I'm happy to not be there yet. We're sort of leveled off. But so I'll tell the buyer, I really want you to focus on what are safety issues and what's really important to you, right? If you're gonna plan to use the chimney every single night, that's probably important to you, right? If you have children in the house, definitely mold, asbestos, anything like that's gonna be super important to you. Those are major safety concerns. Structural issues are gonna be major safety concerns. Let's focus on the big things. I would rather get one $20,000 credit on a structural issue than 20 $500 credits on something small, right? Okay, so I try to focus my buyer on the big picture. Especially if there are backup offers, it was really competitive, things like that, right? Because the seller's probably going to address those items. They're probably not going to address, I had someone ask for the missing stopper in a sink one time. Like little things like that. Cloth wiring is a safety hazard. It might need an upgrade. There might be a problem in the electrical panel. Focus on those main things. A lot of times buyers will get hung up on cosmetic things during the inspection process. It was in that cosmetic condition when they made the offer, right? Oh, also, the sellers, sometimes I've had sellers, because I attract doctors, engineers, attorneys, who go and try to fix it without the buyer asking for it. they're not allowed to make any modification, including repair to the property without approval from the buyer. So let's say it's such a safety issue or an ongoing issue, like it's raining, we're in raining season and there's a roof leak. Let's say there's something like that. Do they need to inform the other side that they're going to be making that repair? Absolutely. And that could open up some issues for negotiation. Maybe the buyer wants a certain type of repair done, if you had options, or a certain company doing it, or a warranty on the work, right? So just keep in mind that I always tell my seller, no, you cannot go fix that. These are people who really like fixing problems, right? Just because we know about the problem does not mean you can touch it. You can't. Contract says you cannot touch it unless the buyer agrees to it, okay? And unless it's an ongoing or major safety concern and the sellers are living there, or it's going to continue causing damage to the property during the course of our escrow, I ask them to just please leave it. Maybe the buyer's not gonna ask for it, right? Maybe the buyer's not gonna ask for it. Okay, so managing the buyer expectation. It's not new construction. Let's focus on what's important here. Let's see here. Oh, so if I'm representing the buyer, like I had one where the chimney, it was like a one house, 1,100,000, and they said that the chimney was structurally unsound and it was a major safety hazard. So the cost for rebuilding it is like $20K. The cost for capping it off and just making it, structurally supported was significantly less. I told my sellers, hey, we can try for the whole thing. Let's not try for, the buyers. Let's try for the whole thing initially. Let's, they may, worst case scenario, I'm guessing they'll meet us in the middle. They did have a backup offer, but anything like that where it's structurally unsound and is an immediate hazard, I'm sure is gonna concern any buyer. So when I talked to the listing agent, I positioned it that way, right? When did I start working on the listing agent? The second we had that inspection, not when I made the request for repair, right? So I advised my buyer, let's go for all of it. I did something a little unorthodox, but it's worked very well for me. And I'm very fortunate, guys. I have not had, except for one in my entire career of my own deals, I've never had more than one deal fall out of escrow. And that's because the inspections were bad and I told the buyer, let's walk away. So I do my best to manage expectations. So I clued the listing agent in, who was not the greatest agent and wasn't present for the inspection, right away. And what I said to her was, I'm going to get some people out there for estimates for the work. Is there anyone that you trust or like using or have used in the past in the area that you'd like me to have come out also? And I did that. And it was someone I had used in the past, so I knew the name and I was familiar with them. And we got 3, I think, estimates. Theirs was $500 less than mine. And the listing agent leaned on the sellers to accept it. They gave us the full $19,500 credit. My buyers were ecstatic. They had it capped off and they pocketed $10K for upgrades.
Wow.
But I don't think we would have got $20,000, except that I said, you know what? Why don't we use someone you trust and like? The listing agent is much more likely to advocate on your behalf and present your request as valid if you are including them in the process. Please discourage your buyers from having their cousins, brothers, uncles, fathers who are contractors come out and give estimates. Why? Because if you're providing that to me and I'm the listing agent, I'm gonna say, I don't think so. I'm gonna tell my seller, I don't necessarily find the information in here unbiased or valid. Let's get a second opinion, and I'm probably gonna fight you on it. All right, let's see. So remember I told you to set this up from the beginning that you and the other agent are on the same team, right? So the strategy I just gave you, which is completely unorthodox but works for me, is that whole, of that same mentality. We're on the same team here. Let's get this resolved, not I'm gonna get my buyers what they want, or your buyers are not getting what my sellers don't want to do. We're on the same team here, we're gonna resolve it. What are some other ideas you might have for resolution? Worst case scenario, I ask maybe the listing agent if they can get their sellers just to throw a little bit of money, even if it's a few $1,000s, because there are some people who really just expect to have that negotiation process, right? Make them feel good, right. A lot of times, I took a whole seminar on high context culture and low context culture. So like Western Europe and the US are low context culture. A contract is a contract is a contract, it's a done deal pretty much, unless something that is unknown comes about. Other places and other cultures that are high context culture, the contract is the beginning of the negotiation process culturally for them. They want to haggle, they want a deal. So a lot of times, you know, I just level with the other side and I'm like, look, my buyer needs to have a teeny bit here. What if the sellers won't budge and it's a minor issue? Or what if I know my buyer's request is unsubstantiated? I have literally had a buyer say, I don't care, find something, I want $5,000 back. And I'm like, you need to give me something I can transfer over. I can't just say you want $5,000 because you don't think it's worth it back. I mean, I can, but they're gonna say no. So if you want any chance for success, you point out a section in an inspection report that you want me to ask for that $5,000 for. Because I don't know what to do. You have the duty of, unfortunately, of obedience to your client. So you can completely disagree from what your client wants to do, but it's not up to you. Right? It just isn't. It is literally a fiduciary duty to be obedient to your client, as long as you're not committing fraud or being dishonest, right? So, didn't put me in the best position when I had to send over that request to the listing agent. She gave me something that I was actually kind of upset about when my buyer got something for nothing. Because I had told him, this is ridiculous, they're never going to say yes, and damn it, they said yes. Not 5,000, but I think they gave us 2,500. So he's a repeat client. Guess what happens every single time I do a deal with him now? Same thing, because they said yes. Oh. All right. Let's see here. So if we're only a few $1,000s off and everyone's being stubborn, and this can happen sometimes, right? Maybe you made a faux pas in the way you positioned something. Maybe the buyer and seller just didn't like something about the way it was written. It can be even the inspection report, right? They don't like the way their house was attacked in the inspection report. It has nothing to do with you or the buyer or the way they behaved or anything. Sometimes I'll throw in commission if I need to. So let's say you have successfully, and maybe I'll ask the listing agent if I'm the buyer's agent or vice versa to throw it in a little bit. Let's say you successfully negotiate after your inspections. How can you receive compensation or resolution to your request? There are 3 ways. The 3 ways are a credit, reduction of purchase price, and actually having work performed. So, let's talk about work performed first. If you are the buyer's agent, you probably want to have the work performed by someone that gave you an estimate. Why? So it ends up being the same cost. And as the buyer, I would actually probably, as a buyer's agent, I would probably stipulate, hey, this is how I want the work done. And by who? Why? Because the seller could use anyone. Maybe it's not warranted. Maybe they weren't licensed. You want it done by a licensed person, right? If the work's being done. There's a whole bunch of liability when the seller has work done instead of just providing a credit or a reduction to purchase price. So I only do it in particular instances. So like the buyers had children and they needed to move in the house and there was mold, right? So the sellers were able to move out of the house a week early and have that mold mediation work done. That wouldn't be my advice though if you can avoid it. I would stick to the credit or reduction of purchase price route. So let's talk about now credit and reduction of purchase price real quick. Well, I have like 10 more minutes, but I know you guys need to move your cars. How do you want to do this? Are we going to recess, move cars, and come back, or do 10 more minutes? Okay. All right. So credit. Credit, sometimes the buyer wants, because if they have a credit, they don't have to bring as much closing funds in at the close of escrow. Maybe they get to keep the money in their savings account for work they want to do once they move into the home. That's no problem. It's also not usually an issue for the seller. The seller's accountant will see their they are going to be taxed by the city on transfer taxes, and that's the whole purchase price. Also, the seller and buyer are gonna pay future taxes, well, the buyer will pay future taxes based on the sales price, and they're gonna pay closing costs to escrow and title based on the sales price. So a credit doesn't reduce any of these things. It does reduce obviously the seller's proceeds. But there is another issue with giving a credit. Usually if there's a loan in place, the buyer's lender is going to have a cap on how much they allow the seller to credit the buyer. I don't know why. Usually they limit it to something that's called a non-recurring closing costs. This means a one-time closing costs, not things that the buyer will pay over the course of the time they own the home. So a non-recurring closing cost would be something like an escrow or title fee, but not taxes or insurance, because they're gonna have taxes and insurance recurring on that property during the time they own it. You won't necessarily have a good estimate for what is recurring or non-recurring, let alone closing costs when they're lumped together. So if you're going to do a credit, you wanna make sure the buyer's agent checks with the lender to make sure that the lender is okay with that credit amount. Sometimes they're like, oh, it's fine up until $10,000. You want to make sure you take care of this. Also, you wanna make sure the lender and escrow know about any credits right away. Why? They're going to have to amend some documents in the underwriting loan process, and escrow is gonna have to create an amendment for them. And who is it on if this information doesn't get transferred? Probably the buyer's agent, right? Because you are the person conveying information to the lender directly most of the time. Escrow might forget to send that amendment that they draft for a credit over to the lender. So at the time I come to resolution for a credit, I CC the listing agent, escrow, and the lender, and I just say, hey, lender, Mr. and Mrs. Lender, buyer and seller have agreed to do a credit of blah, blah, blah amount. Is that okay, or do we need to instead apply a portion or all of it as a reduction to the purchase price? So reduction of purchase price is exactly what it sounds like. You may do a combo, repair, credit, and reduction. You could do a combo of two of those three in any way. If it's going to be a reduction, you simply draft an AEA, an amendment to existing terms. And escrow is going to draft an amendment as well. Buyer and seller sign off on it. It goes over to the lender, and it goes to escrow. And what else might you need to change? You might need to change, if you've already done it, your green sheet, or also referred to as commission disbursement here in the office. If that purchase price changes, it would be considered classy and industry standard to also reduce your commission. Not to worry, it's probably like $30, okay? Unless it's like, hundreds of thousands of dollars, it's going to be a very minute change to your commission, all right?
So that form is AEA?
Yeah, AEA. Now we're going to very quickly talk about these forms that support the process we just talked about, okay? So, number one is receipt for reports. The acronym is, what is this? RFR. I want to note that RFR used to actually be our request for repairs, and a few years ago they changed it. So receipt for reports is the document used if you have a seller report that you're providing to the buyer, okay? So this is going to be less common than the other documents that we're gonna talk about in our packet, okay? So if you're the listing agent and the seller has reports, or you did a pre-listing inspection, you're going to make sure that you send over this RFR, receipt for reports, showing that you gave the information to the buyer and buyer's agent. On page, on this page, it actually has you list out like the name of the company and type of report and date prepared and all of that as well. All right, so we're gonna move on to the next document, contingency removal. Here's a little trick. If you are asking the seller for anything, repair, credit, reduction of purchase price, there's a way on your request for the repair form to say, if the seller agrees to all of the things we're asking for, we hereby lift the contingency removal. See the attached contingency removal form, right? That's dangling a carrot. You have it right there, already signed by the buyer, waiting to go. All the seller has to say is yes. This is probably one of the reasons that buyer's agents like to hold the inspection reports until the very end and surprise the seller and listing agent. Don't do that. Don't do that. You wanna cause yourself problems on either end of the transaction, it's a good way to cause yourself problems. When people feel rushed and, up against a wall, they are less likely to go into things in informed manners, and, at the end of the day, when you deliver bad news, sometimes it takes someone a day or two to come to their senses about it, right? I have had sellers so many times say, no, tell them to go to hell, cancel. But I'm like, you know what? No problem, but can you do me a favor? Can you give it, and sleep on it? Take a day or two? I know it's a big request, take a day or two. And they come to their senses and we're able to work it out. But if I don't have that day or two, my seller doesn't have the time to think about it, or my buyer doesn't have the time to think about it, okay? All right, so we're gonna move on to the seller response and buyer reply to request for repair. Actually, am I missing one? I don't have the request for repair here,
That's on
guys.
the very
It's on the
Oh.
first
The
page.
first thing.
This one?
No,
I think I have a packet that's incomplete. No. Oh, request for repair, yeah, I'm missing a page in mine. Let me see if I tossed it. All right, here we go. Sorry, request for repair, the most important one because that's what we're talking about. So, you're gonna use this request for repair when you make your request as the buyer's agent, Form RR. Does the listing agent ever draft this document? No. Who's making a request for repair? The buyer. So the buyer's agent is drafting this. Okay, so, section 1, buyer requests. So you can request in section 1A that the seller, prior to final verification of condition, which is, guys, the buyer's final walkthrough, is the other term for that. Repair or take the other specified action for each item listed below or on the attached list stated. A lot of times there's an attached list to here because this document is so small you can't fit in all the info you need. We're gonna skip down now to section 1B. Is the option to have section 1 work completed as specified in the attached pest control report, which would be your termite report. Once again, I highly recommend not actually documenting or having this work done this way by selecting the section 1 item. Why? Because if this request for repair somehow ever makes it to escrow or the lender, it's gonna be an issue. I would highly recommend having your seller credit your buyer for the work. Also, if it needs to be tented, it means that your seller would need to move out of the house during that tenting prior to closing escrow or having all the contingencies removed. So if you can at all avoid having termite work done, avoid it. Do a credit instead or a reduction to purchase price. 2BII, section 2, buyer requests seller to have section 2 work completed. Section 2 work would be a rare item from the termite report, so that's not usually done. We're gonna move on to section C. Buyer requests that the seller credit buyer and a blank dollar amount. Here's your total dollar amount. That dollar amount can be scary. So, I recommend writing C attached in here and breaking it down on an attached sheet so that that initial response is itemized. Because if I see 20 grand instead of 5, 3, 2, and I see that they're each individual valid credit requests for valid concerns, at first my heart's just gonna drop when I see that 20K. I would rather see attached and see it itemized out, and then a total line item down at the very bottom, at the very end of your last page of your request, okay? And then, let's see. D, buyer requests that seller reduce the purchase price to blank, all right? So there could be a combination. Make sure you are very clear in however you make your request for repairs. There are many different ways to do it. All it has to do is make sense to you and the other side, right? So this form is not always the easiest way to do it, which is why it's very common to attach a form to explain what it is you're asking, and if you're asking for a combination of reduction and credit, it shows you how you work out those numbers and why you're working it out that way, okay? Take the time to explain yourself. This is the number one reason escrows cancel is your inspection negotiation. Number one reason.
So should you put C attached also in D and then just attach explanation?
Well, if you're asking for a reduction in the purchase price, you may just be asking for a credit. You may be asking for work to be done. It depends on your situation at that time. All right? Okay, so, also, let's see. Seller response. So if the seller says okay, you're just going to go ahead and check that box, seller agrees to all buyer's requests. If they don't, if they do, you're also going to check that box, buyer removes those contingencies identified on the attached contingency removal form. So if the buyer at the time they made their request did not dangle the carrot of giving you a contingency removal, if the seller agrees to their request in full, the seller is going to respond and say yes, but only if you sign this attached contingency removal. Very important. Do not agree without having them remove that. It means that you can agree, their contingency is still in place. What if they have another inspection and make another request? It just ties things up longer, okay? The next checkbox is seller does not agree to buyer's request. Seller just flat out refuses. This is really difficult, right? I always recommend that if at all possible, if you can convince your seller instead to respond, they do so, even if that means we'll credit you $500. Even if you say to your seller, gosh, I'll credit you $500 from my commission to credit them $500. Why? You want to keep the conversation going if this is at all something that you can work out. So the last one, which is generally the most common when I see a request for repair, is seller responds to the buyer's request on the attached form RRRR, which is another document in the package that I have for you here. So we have RRR, which is RR, which is request for repair, and then RRR, which is seller's response to buyer request for repair. Let me get back to that. Okay, so the seller has a variety of ways to respond to the buyer's request on their RRRR form. And anytime I use an acronym that's in car forms, I'm more explaining for the people watching at home than you guys. So let's read through them really quickly. And remember, it can be a combination, it can be unorthodox. If you need additional space or need to clarify anything, please write in here, see attached, and break it down and document it out in an attached document and attach it here, okay? All right, so 1, seller responds to buyer request. Seller agrees to A, to all of buyer requests and request for repair number, and you reference their request number because sometimes this can be like a multi-step process like counter offers, guys. I highly encourage you to get on the phone and do some verbal negotiation with the listing agent if you need to, instead of going back and forth. You've got a really tough situation on your hands if you've got RRRR4. Nobody wants to have RRRR4, right? It's already a mouthful. So, seller agrees to all of buyer's requests in repair number blank except blank. So maybe they're gonna say yes to most of them, but not this one. Or 1B, at close of escrow to credit buyer blank. C, to reduce the purchase price to blank. D, other. Most of the time, if there's a combination, instead of being confusing and checking multiple boxes here, I'm probably, just like I said, going to select D, other, and say C, attached, and I'm gonna break it down and explain it in plain English so that it makes sense. Why? It also has to make sense to, it has to make sense to everyone, right? It has to make sense to everyone. Now, like I said, the lender and escrow, a lot of times, the way that they're going to take instruction from you to make a reduction to purchase price or a credit is this document. So, if you are talking about scary things and a lender sees that, they're gonna have an issue. So I highly recommend, if you're using these documents, writing anything scary on an attached document, and instead of providing your outcome, your accepted whatever it is, infinity R, I highly recommend drafting an AEA, amendment of existing terms, with your outcome. seller to credit and not saying what it's for. Seller to credit buyer 10K, or seller to reduce purchase price from blah, blah, blah to blah, blah, blah. And giving instead that AEA document to escrow so that they can draft what they need to, and so that the lender can reduce, or change the loan documents on their side for whatever they need to, okay? All right, section 2 of this seller response. Seller agreement only applies if buyer, A, removes, this is boilerplate, it's not a checkbox, removes in writing the physical inspection contingency. So, it's not optional. If you're using this form and the buyer agrees to it, they're removing their physical inspection. You still need that contingency removal form. Make sure it's in there. That's the next section, 2B, removes those contingencies identified on the attached contingency removal form, car form CR number blank, which must be signed by buyer. And C, releases seller and brokers from any loss, liability, expense, claim, or cause of action regarding the disclosed condition of the property. Release. Alright, so you can't go sue a seller for mold that you knew was in the house, right? That's what this is saying. If you know about it, we've come to terms, you can't go after me for it. You had that chance, we negotiated our outcome, the concession I was willing to make to you as a seller to the buyer, okay? Alright, and then, the process can be a vicious little cycle. The buyer therefore either accepts or responds on a new RR number 2. I hope you don't get to number 2. I highly encourage picking up that phone and working it out verbally. That's it, guys. Questions?
If you put in a request for repair and the seller takes a very long time to respond to it, and the contingency period's almost over, and then they finally respond, how much time would you have then at that point to make a decision?
You don't necessarily have time. I would verbally discuss with the listing agent those expectations, right? They're probably going to want a response pretty quickly, but at any time the seller, if your contingency period is near expiration, can preemptively, 2 days preemptive can serve you a notice to perform, or any time thereafter. So you'd have 2 days from the time a notice to perform is served, but I don't want to get into that contentious situation, so I try to negotiate a reasonable response time. So when I receive something, I'm probably contacting my buyers first, and maybe we need to get some more information or they need time to think about it. I'm trying to estimate how long that's going to be. I'm gonna call the listing agent and say, hey, just got this, I need time to discuss it with my buyers. I expect to have a response for you at this time. And just set up some expectation. But the answer to that question is, you don't have any time. They can serve you that notice to perform at any time, but once they do, you have 2 days, the way our contract is written. Any more? By the way, you guys don't have to be here, but if you wanna hear, we're done with class. We're done with the lesson, but if you have questions, go ahead.
In case you represent both buyer and seller,
Yeah.
I mean, that it comes up, seems like that's very difficult, much more complicated because.
It can be more complicated.
Well, how
So
do you
dual
do-
representation is rough. I actually think inspection negotiation with dual representation is one of the easier things, because I knew the inspectors. I recommended them. I know they're being honest. I was there. No one's misrepresenting anything. Everyone's getting exactly the same information. That doesn't mean my buyer and seller are going to agree, but I at least don't have to do double the work checking the estimates and the accuracy.